I am for discipline. I am for clarity.
I have invented the word la ville radieuse, which cannot be translated in English.
He's usually quoted nearly everything that I've said, and not quite the way I said it.
Peter and Caomhán have generously supported the AAI down through the years with their time and their effort. They established their practice in 2005. It was founded on a shared interest in both the continuing development of architectural practice and the unchanging essential nature of architecture. They have a strong interest in collaborative practice, working with clients, artists, engineers, other architects, designers and the wider public, as illustrated by their recent Granby Park project. In October of this year, along with GKMP and Ryan Kennihan, they were invited by Ray Ryan and Nathalie Weadick, along with Irish Design 2015, to represent Ireland at the inaugural Chicago Architecture Biennial with the New Horizon Architecture from Ireland installation. Before I hand you over to Peter, I'd just like to also thank Irish Design 2015, who are kindly supporting this lecture series, and the Department of History and Art and Architecture at Trinity College, who facilitate all our talks in Trinity. Without further ado, Peter Cowell. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ronan. It's a pleasure and an honour to be opening the series. It's been 6 years since I've been up here on the podium, and I feel like I'm coming back to confession to give you my sins, but bear with me. 10 years of practice feels like a very short period of time, and for myself, Caomhán, and everyone in A2, it's been a bit of a roller coaster, ups and downs, and I'll speak about some of them later on as we progress through the talk. But I open with one grid and I'm going to end with another grid, and I suppose I've titled the lecture Holding Pattern purposefully because I often very much think honestly about my work as an eclectic, in that I don't necessarily know what direction I might be going in. I know I need to land at a certain point, and the more I practice with Caomhán and everyone in A2, the more we realise you just have to make that Captain Sully Sullenberger decision and just take the Hudson and just land it. Nobody else is going to tell you how to do it, how to get jobs. You have to literally go out there and make the opportunities yourself. The drawing that I have, it's something that has become more and more present in both the practice and where I teach. This is a drawing of Limerick City, and it was an opening drawing that I did to begin a PhD study that has started and stopped and started and stopped in an enjoyable way, and it'll probably continue for many years. But it's looking at the founds of the city of Limerick, particularly Newtown Perry, at a point when the medieval city was turning its kind of direction towards a new idea of city and a new idea of architect, from master builder to architect, and the notion of pattern, infrastructure, order become a lot more kind of present. And I particularly like pointing out the idiosyncrasies within this plan. And it's a drawing, a grid that the tightest grid lines are the sewer lines going down the centres of the streets. It's a basement drawing, I should add. It's trying to look at the ground where ground is excavated and deposited. And the whole of Limerick City's Newtown Perry is built up off the ground. So there's this whole stratum of structure and service and grain and increment that I'm particularly interested in. So what you see here are cellar walls going back to party walls and going back to stables and various outbuildings, and just looking at the grains, and the principal grain of O'Connell Street, as you can see it, as this kind of like combed fishbone through the centre of the plan and all of the secondary streets. I cannot but kind of relate to the 10 years of Sol as well in all of this. I've been very, very lucky to teach with very, very, very kind colleagues. Number one being Merit Buchholz, our professor, and many, many others. I mean, I could list many, but it's been a very formative place. And it offers both distance from practice, but also an interrogation of everything that we do. And this is another kind of mapping or cartography of the County Mayo landscape. It's 10 miles by 10 miles, and up to this point you can see Mayo and the airport of Knock by Monsignor Horan. And this network and capillary kind of joints and kind of woodworm of hedgerows and byroads, and that kind of resilient infrastructure that kind of is so characteristic of so much of our country and yet is unmapped. And there's a strong interest in our intelligence units over the summers to almost represent or rediscover the larger kind of realities of our kind of inhabitation of this island of Ireland. And it's just almost drawing what is there. And part of those studies we have done one island, which was looking at a county on the west coast and a county on the east coast, Fingal being on the east and Mayo being on the west, and comparing the two almost grains of the counties and trying to explore both binaries as well as comparisons and shared kind of ideas of land. One city looking at the city as a boundless object within a geography of the Midwest being Limerick, and it not having a boundary, and it challenging the development plans at the time to kind of think about the city as an environment, a much larger environment without bounds. Pilot schools inventories with the Department of Education, designing policies again with Limerick City and County Council and other departments from the university, smarter travel, which has become a reality in the city and is beginning to bear great fruit, and a study of Shannon Airport, SNN Plus, and looking at the future of that. And I suppose practice can only give you so much, and it's sometimes very pleasurable to jump to the larger scale, the macro scale, and to jump back again to the micro scale. And I found this elastic language very, very enjoyable. I also want to put up the smaller scale. There's a strong interest in the school in Irish timber, and juvenile Irish timber in particular, given that we have so much of it and that it grows so fast and that it only gains a certain strength. And as we all know here, this is the clash of the ash. And what I particularly like about this piece of timber is obviously its kind of moment where it's almost about to break, and it's almost about to kind of like snap in the clash with the other hurley, that I just find kind of extraordinarily powerful and still needs to be tested in how we think about our own timbers. And this is the space of the school. It's a large forum space, quite introverted, in the centre of Limerick campus, University of Limerick, and everyone hears everything, and we talk at large about everything from mapping to details to construction. And this particular class is just an overview of our interest in timber, and it's kind of again beginning to bear very, very interesting potential. We work a lot with engineers, and it's only in the last maybe 10 years again that I've realised what it is to work with an engineer, not as another discipline but as a colleague. And this is the great Tom Cosgrove. Tom worked for Punch as many years and now is the Professor of Civil Engineering. And before Tom became the Professor of Civil Engineering, he was the professor. He taught engineering to our students. And apart from looking like Isaac Newton, he just generates this great passion among students and staff alike, and again has this very, very strong interest in knowing about the lived kind of and the living qualities of construction. And we've learned a huge amount out of him, and I've benefited an enormous amount from Tom. Something about myself as well, and if you pardon the kind of the holding pattern notion again, I'm trying to kind of paint a picture, not perhaps a very clear one, but thinking back to the idea of survey and what Heidegger would have called, what was it? It's called circumnavigation, a concernful circumspect. That's it. A concernful circumspect. Not just looking and drawing what is there, but thinking and trying to find new things, new ideas, and new opportunities. And this was a study of a train carriage that I did while working in John and Sheila's office. I wasn't doing it while I was working there. It was in the weekends. I hope John and Sheila aren't here and they're thinking I was doing all this work around their back. But apart from the wonderful experience that was working in that office, I also, I suppose, was given an opportunity to work on the detailing of many projects, particularly Ranelagh School, Letterfrack Furniture College, Galbally Housing, and other very, very interesting projects. But in that period of time, I was spending a lot of time going back and forth to Limerick, where I'm from. And this Craven passenger coach back in 1999 was decommissioned, and the rolling stock, a lot of it arrived into the Limerick rail yards. And I built up a relationship with the station manager and kind of decided, well, what not better kind of study to do than something that you're very, very familiar with and use quite regularly. So I set out to do this over a period of 1.5 years. And they're pencil drawings, all at A1. There's about 20 of them. And what I particularly like, again, about this particular study is something that we don't really see anymore, which is this community around a table that has a particular shape and a particular comfort in terms of the upholstery of the seats. The ability to be able to open up a window while travelling and to be able to comfortably put luggage up on racks up above. And just the ergonomics and the care that goes into making all of these composite kind of pieces of furniture that somehow make a very, very comfortable environment. And somehow we're going, I feel, further and further from that interest in the intrinsic. So these studies go on, they're not all at the same scale. This is a study of the tubular chair and its various connections to the ground and to the side where it rests and supports itself, and how these circular hollow tubes meet flats and square angular sections, and again how this makes for a particular incline that is shaped to the back and the seated position. Let me go back, sorry. This is the table. And again, not to dwell on it too much, but just picking up on the very subtle bend in the table to allow for one person to get out comfortably over another if they're seated. And small details like the ashtray on the table underneath to allow for people to smoke comfortably while they talked, a kind of a forgotten kind of period in our time. And also how melamine goes around a corner and is able to make an edge on this table. And they might sound kind of a little bit reminiscent in my kind of wanderings, but I do like that quality, and I do kind of like seek that out in the work that we do. And this is a toilet cubicle, and looking at all the kind of like the incidents of sitting on a toilet, grabbing the toilet roll, being able to stand up, not feeling that you're going to be rocked out of place, how you might fit a tap into a wall that comfortably doesn't project too much and affect the comfort of a person using the toilet. And then on to other projects. And I'm going to intersperse the lecture with a few key projects that I am endeared to. And the first one is Lutyens' Alambe Island from 1904. And I had the absolute pleasure of going to this place last April with Grania Hassett and Colin Moore and Generella Breen and many others, Jack and Rachel. And I was just blown away by the ability of this environment. Again, this circular, a furlong in diameter, 660 feet or 220 yards, just over 200 meters from one point to the other. And just not so much the pure kind of shape of the circle that fascinated me at the time. It's probably the only kind of treed area of this island. Everything outside this large bounding 7-meter high wall that Lutyens built is quite barren. But inside here, what I am completely drawn to is the fact that none of these lines are parallel or at right angles to one another. They're all slightly set off against one another, and they almost have their own energy in relation to one another in this kind of very dense, kind of non-direct architecture. Even trying to find out the center point of this plan, one wonders whether it's here or whether it's there at the entrance to the door. And then you look at the kitchen garden and how it's a trapezoid that sits off tangentially off the edge of this amazing circular bastion wall. And again, thinking a little bit about the survey and this concernful circumspection, if I can call it that, is a need to look at what is around us a little bit more carefully. And it's not necessarily needing to invent or innovate, but to look and to think a little bit more about what we have. And to jump on, again, projects of ours will be brought into this. This is probably where we would like to be in the practice, but we haven't yet got there. These are competition entries. This was for Kingswood School, a school for 1,000 pupils back 2 years ago. And again, we were very drawn to this dense architecture, almost an interest in compaction and how one might make a simple perimeter that contains a world. And in this instance, we have large rooms close to the edge that make for all of these receiving spaces here, and the sports hall to the pitches on the outside, but also how to make these strong connections in a suburban environment. This is 100 meters in diameter. And again, what we were hoping to do here was to make a perimeter of concrete, and all of the infill language and landscape would be precast or prefabricated timber panels, and how it might step down this landscape in a kind of a parterre. So the school almost becomes like a parterre garden in a way. And something that has become quite kind of prevalent in our work is this notion that you don't need to have a front and a back. You can approach your building from any side, that it's permeable from all faces. And that was something that we kind of desired. It's not something that we have been able to achieve quite yet in terms of gaining that scale. This is the context of Tala. And just down here you have Robin Walker's very fine church just off the map, a community school here, a health centre, and our kind of proposal for the 1,000 pupil school. And part of that brief, I suppose, was an interest again in thinking about the facade as a kind of a frieze of 1,000 pupils. So much like the Parthenon, this kind of narrative around the project as representing the kind of inhabitants, so that there's all these activities around the edge and people would somehow relate to this facade in a kind of a comfortable manner. We've had the luck to build schools. This is our Eurocampus school, very beautifully photographed by Marie-Louise Halpenny, again, who we love to collaborate with. This is the entrance to the school. It's a kind of a shared relationship between the French and the Germans, the Deutsche Schule and the Lycée Français d'Irlande. And something that you'll see again in our work is this interest in making ground and kind of making a socle for other things to rise from. And on top of that then you have this new roof that's added that creates this kind of sandwich, again a kind of compaction. And working with the ground and working with the levels to make a kind of like an interesting landscape. And other features that you will see in this, like the double heights brick panel, is something that appears in housing that we did in Lucky Lane, which I will talk a little bit about again. But there is a strong interest in the external and the semi-external space. And we purposely pushed the envelope back, tried to minimize the amount of circulation inside. And given that there was no communal room in this extension to the French and the German school, it was effectively 18 classrooms. We decided we would try and make communal rooms out of the external spaces. So in a way, the forecourt and the entry space is the first hall, and that's marked by this double height and the kind of grabbing of this brick ramp that turns into a concrete ramp. And I would dearly love to be able to do more schools like this. It's just so hard to get onto tender lists, and we spend quite an amount of time trying to get work like this, and because this is 5 or 6 years old, we just can't seem to get that work anymore. And this was an opportunity that was handed to us 6 years ago now, when all the other larger practices were too busy to entertain taking on an 18 classroom extension to a South Dublin school. But we learned a huge amount out of this, and it's ingrained in our practice now not to fear kind of larger projects and not to feel that we can only stay to the realm of domestic space. And again, an interest in economy. This is a very simple section made of bare blockwork that's painted, considering ventilation with a stack effect up through the classrooms so that nobody suffers from stagnant air in the classrooms, and thinking about clear-story windows within the school classrooms themselves and being able to borrow light and to get an extension of space along the soffits of these ceilings. And also a use of colour. These are the French, German and the Irish flags that are combined and mixed up to make 3-storey party walls. And when you look at the school in the evening time, you get this melange of flags and colours that makes for quite a nice, colourful environment. We went on to do a small extension to Ireland's largest secondary school, which is Gorey. It's got 2,600 pupils. I've never been anything like this before. There's, I think, 100 staff, and it's like entering into a chicken hut in the break times, just with the amount of chat and banter. It's absolutely incredible. But we were asked to add on 3 classrooms out onto the back of the school, and we described a kind of a new entrance to this school, and we kind of twisted their arm to kind of encourage them to make another almost Palladian arm onto this relatively ordinary 1980s school. And again, it's driven by an economy of plan and section and construction. So this is the context. Here we make a small pocket gravel garden. We try and relate to the parapets and the materiality of the school that exists, and make for a kind of a sunny disposition for these pupils. Terrific outfits. I was always intrigued by those tartan dresses. It is a boys and girls, it's a co-ed school, but again an interest in making ground, power floating a concrete slab and sanding it afterwards, using a gravel that's close to the aggregate of the concrete, using blockwork that is both fair-faced and chipped to make texture, and to allow for the glazing to run around and tie relationships to heights and data within the school itself. Another area that we are trying desperately to get work, and I'm sure we're not the only practice who are doing so, is housing. And I was very fortunate to collaborate with Peter Cody, a friend and colleague in Boyd Cody, in curating the Lisbon Architecture Triennial back in 2007. This was 2 years after we set up, and the majority of our work was extensions. And not to say that that hasn't changed, it's still there, the world of extensions, and it's very helpful. But we set out to formulate a strategy for the city in that if everyone was to work in their back gardens, the city would become incredibly dense. And while it's one thing to say that we haven't done that much housing, we have a strong interest in housing and domestic space. And I often go back to this piece of research, not just an exhibition, but a piece of research about city, and think about the smaller, more incremental moves that we are all so familiar with, our own back gardens, our own front gardens, or our own streets. And we've had the pleasure of working on some very interesting house extensions, this one being in Portobello, that's driven by an intent about span and an interest in party wall and the grain of the city, and a generosity of flow from a very, very deep space to a shallow space, and how they might combine within this kind of active section. To working on further competitions, and this is probably us flexing our muscle a little bit. We came second in the European housing competition back in 2010 for Ballymun, and the site that was close to the central boiling plant, this terrific, almost Stirling-esque metal-clad boiler plant in the very, very centre of Ballymun. And up to that point, Ballymun was being generated by an idea of Main Street, and even though it was called a street, it was actually a motorway that was running right through the town of Ballymun. So we chose to engender a cross-axis or a counter-axis in the opposite direction to the main street to try and connect a number of pocket parks along this route. So it was a strong kind of move, and we made this inner underworld of kind of undercroft where light would come down through these spaces and into a kind of a covered public space that would contain the central boiling plant and retain the chimney as a kind of a vertical icon for both the past and the future of Ballymun. And again, we pretty quickly go to model. This is the counter axis here that we were making. It's an elevated walkway like Galfetti's public baths in Bellinzona, that has artist studios, big robust warehouses, a concrete bridge, a further kind of cafe stroke health centre at the end of this bridge, and then the suspended world of timber and I-beam housing. And almost again going back to the school that I showed you in Tala and Lambay Island, an interest in a kind of a continuity or a carpeting that creates this kind of environment for living. So this is from the back. And this is the section in greater detail. And these are the units that were developed in various configurations, red being the parts that can move and can be manipulated, and the green being terraces that both step up and under and around these kind of like combining units. And from that, I suppose, we went to build our only housing scheme so far, which is 2 Muse houses and potentially 10 more up in Stoneybatter. And I particularly like this chimney. I mean, I've spent maybe how many years, 7 years of my life now living in this area of the city. This is a view from the Andre Wehert's Coke can on the top of the chimney in Smithfield. That's no longer open, but it's looking back towards the grain of the city at these thousands of chimneys. And it still happens to be the densest part of Dublin. It's got 1,800 housing units per hectare, which is quite substantial and is denser than parts of the Docklands. I think it might be surpassed now by Spencer Dock, but it's still worthy of study and interest. And again, like kind of the interest in survey and this need to look, this is a repeated typology. And what interested us and drove us in this particular project was not so much an interest in individual work, but almost trying to find an unproblematic kind of typology that would allow for autonomy and a dependence on the city. So not so much where the architect is present as describing a kind of my work. It's more about building a piece of city and almost becoming background. And that's very much present, I think, in these artisan houses from the turn of the century, built by the Guinness philanthropists and the Dublin Artisan Dwelling Society. And finding, again, like the train carriages, this is an original drawing which I scanned from the architectural archive of these typologies and the serious economy that you get in these structures. Incredibly dense, incredibly tight, 2 up, 2 down houses, each room with a chimney, a scullery out the back in a small single-storey return, and a very careful consideration for section and how to maximise storage over stairs, storage under stairs, and the ability to be able to relate to the scale of a lane and to make some civic presence out onto a very fine footpath. And like the housing in Tala and our schools, there is this very present kind of continuity in Stoneybatter. I fail to ever kind of walk up one of these streets without kind of becoming excited about a small detail or about the streetscape or about the kind of the texture of the brick. It's a really remarkable area. So into this grain, here you have Houston Station, you have Devaney Gardens, here you've got the markets and the barracks, and you've got McKee Barracks up here. This was an area that was built purposely to house all of those people who would be working in the barracks, the markets, and down to the Inchicore Railway Works. So you get this very, very interesting grain that eventually turns its direction to the southwest and the northeast. And this is the kind of the new street that we made, Lucky Lane, in the back gardens of houses in Ockram Street. And like this kind of blurring of boundary that I spoke originally about, we purposely dragged that into our intent in this by making the party wall be something that isn't a linear element, but that would actually turn like a Z. So it's shared from one house and then it becomes part of another house, very, very purposefully to kind of like make this ground condition that is not so obviously delineated by ownership. An axonometric of this showing the cellular rooms on the ground floor, 2 bedrooms and a study with a small rubbish area, heated by air-to-water heat pump and mechanical heat recovery, and then up to a shared kitchen, living, dining space with a morning terrace to the back of the house and an evening terrace to the front of the house. And here you have the plan, a section that relates to both the back of Carnew Street and the back of the houses on Ockram Street. So in a way, acknowledging the return of this house and this house here, the house becomes a double return house, where there's a return that faces Carnew Street and a return that faces Ockram Street. And it settles itself back into this world of garden walls. And very present in this was a need to be economical. It was being built for myself without too much personality, so that nobody would be frightened of wanting to kind of develop one of these types of houses in the back gardens. I wasn't being indirect about it, but I certainly enjoyed kind of trying to convince people about this kind of type and trying to develop a new type of house. So this is onto the lane, quite a crude kind of environment, quite rough and ready, something I like. Galvanized gates, warehouses, workshops, rubbish bags, dirt, dogs, strangers. We could go on. There's many a fire and many a bonfire, many cars that are burnt out here, so it needs a certain protection, but it's not so closed. Ultimately, this screen here on the first floor is a spite screen to not look into the amenity of Carnew Street, and these large sliding galvanized doors with a pedestrian door built into them slide across so that you have a carport. Now, I don't drive, so it's very often used as a room, but it's very handy for our friends and guests. And into this space here, this is the front driveway. Everything is tried to be considered. This is a kind of a carpet or a mat of concrete that's held off the edge by 125 mil. Brick continues in from the outside and makes the surface of this party wall that is present on the first floor. And the structure is a pared back galvanized mild steel channel with infill anodized aluminium screens. A little bit slow, apologies. So the ground floor, there's an interest in the floor being continuous. There's no change in surface. The ceiling is left unpainted and is continuous, and gaps between all of the surfaces are maintained at 10 millimeters to acknowledge their ability to be able to be changed. These are all quite lightweight in construction. They're mostly plywood, timber stud, and the party walls then are acknowledged as the masonry heavier walls of the house. And like the carport at the entrance, this is another kind of like Knight's Move courtyard that is planted with Irish ferns and Irish multi-stem birch trees. And you can begin to see the dialogue with the blind wall of the return at the back of the Ockram Street houses. There are curtains now and there are mattresses. I promise, don't live like a complete monk. And upstairs then is a slightly lighter world that takes advantage of the light. This is Sarah, my first housemate, where Sarah's working at the kitchen that's designed to be quite block-like and surface oriented. No handles, again 10 millimeters drives every joint. And the floors are held apart. These are decking boards that are turned upside down and used to allow for the joists to be visible. Not everybody likes them, particularly grannies who come to visit for open house. But that's part of the learning process. And this very nice relationship then with the light and the fact that there's no capping stone on the roof and it's allowed to weather like a garden wall and is beginning to grow moss, which is quite enjoyable. And the lines from the inside rooms run out to the outside decks. And again, all the surfaces are unpainted to, I suppose, respect the workmanship and admire the workmanship of the plasterer who worked on this with quite a nice marbling effect. Looking back the other direction then towards the house onto Ockram Street, and that dialogue between the buttered brick of the back of Ockram Street and the return courtyard, and then this kind of deep winter light that comes into the house in October, November. Continuing that dialogue, this is a conversation, I would say a rather robust conversation that we've had, not just with the client, but also this type of house. This is a Georgian house in Rathmines that we worked on in collaboration with Esther Gerrard and John Gerrard, brother and sister. John, who we've collaborated on quite a lot with, and Ed Coveney, who is a stonemason. And our brief here was to try and divide up a pretty common typology in Dublin, which is a 3-story over basement Georgian house, into 5 units. 2 studios in the back return and 1 studio space on the top. If I can jump ahead, this is the 2-bedroom apartment on the top floor where we punctured a roof light. This is the first floor 1-bedroom apartment that we again made 1 single opening into and made 1 secret door. A ground floor and basement duplex that is 2-bedroom stroke study. And the 1 insertion that we made here was a staircase to the back room that allows us to take half of the stairs as it goes down from the existing staircase. And I suppose in a way what we learned about this is a listed property, and we effectively took the house apart and put it back together again. It was like a jigsaw, and a jigsaw where we lost the instructions on many occasions. And much to our own angst and much to the angst of the clients, it became a very, very difficult project, but ultimately a very enjoyable one. I think at distance you can begin to enjoy this. And the value that we take from this particular house type is, I suppose, its ubiquity or its perpetuity in our cities, not just in Dublin, but Limerick, Galway, Waterford, everywhere. This Georgian typology spreads. And we found this kind of, again, a very economical working with plan, with section, with very acupunctural moves, knowing where to put a stairs, knowing where to put an opening or a doorway in order to enable or to get over building regulations such as fire or conservation rules or disability access. I mean, the amount of bureaucracy in these things could be so much more pared back, and the amount of characters and obstacles and people that you meet during this design process is phenomenal, and ultimately you end up, designing a staircase. And you spend your kind of 1.5 to 2 years struggling with this. And again, we will get to enjoy it, but at the moment it's still very, very fresh as a kind of a robust conversation that we need to end somehow. This is an entrance porch into the house. It's a very delicate house. It's an early Georgian house that has many, many houses within it. So it's a house that has a house built on top of another house that is built on top of another house. So you have older structures that are buried in at the back, and the Georgian house makes its way out towards the Leinster Road eventually. So you get these very dainty doors, very domestic, beautiful fanlights with pure geometry, very interesting wall surfaces which we chose to try and keep at their original patina. Walls which, with the client and with the workers there, we had very, very good contractors on this job. We were working with pigmented lime putty and lime render, and trying to almost piece the thing back together again to have this sense of kind of time and workmanship. Staining the floors black in order to give them this kind of deeper anchoring, and eventually waxing them with a hard oil wax. And introducing certain doors that would be much, much taller than your typical door, and playing this dramatic kind of relationship between flush secret doors to a bathroom, getting rid of a lobby into the kitchen, living, dining space by having a domestic sprinkler system, and having large, tall openings from front to back that would somehow echo the kind of window boxes of the house. Yeah, I suppose we did really enjoy this. We did enjoy it. And I suppose part of that collaboration built itself from a relationship that we've enjoyed with John Gerrard, the Irish artist. This was a bench that we did in Limerick, a pig slat bench. And again, this was a second-hand slatted floor section for pigs and growing pigs in County Limerick farms. And it was for an area of Limerick City called Pigtown, where O'Mara's bacon factory used to be. And we were interested in playing on that kind of narrative with the city. So we went and surveyed a number of farm yards and picked out kind of pieces that we liked, and we tried to combine farrowing cage handles with these pig slat flooring sections, and ennobling a kind of an otherwise piece of fairly utilitarian galvanized mild steel into something that could be pleasurable to sit on. And likewise with his studio in Vienna, where we were developing very delicate pieces of furniture to very robust pieces of island units in an Austrian granite, and carefully placing them together almost like cardboard, where you wouldn't miter the joints but place them kind of face to face in a kind of a more direct relationship, and just making very, very simple kind of openings into service spaces. So you get this long nave space and into a back space at the back. Okay, I'm kind of 3/4 the way through, I promise. This is another project that completely blows my socks every time I see it and I draw it. I spent many years after working with John and Sheila in Dublin in Rafael Meneo's office in Madrid, and every opportunity that I had, I would try and get down to Cordoba to look at this mosque, the Mezquita, in the center of the Jewish area in Cordoba from 789, built by the Moors, developed by the Moors, conquested by the Catholics, taken back by the Moors, and eventually conquested again by Catholics by building this cathedral in the center of the plan. And I suppose what I like about the plan, not so much in the rituals, it's fascinating how people use this, or how they would have used it as a prayer hall to the mihrab, which is the prayer room towards Mecca. But the way of using these edges and this kind of thickened wall, almost like Lutyens' bastion wall to Uncharity, as he called it in Lambay Island. And this is a reflected ceiling plan that looks up at the increment of these voussoir arches, the horseshoe arches that we all know, and its relationship to the spine walls that are in stone. There's over 850 columns in this particular complex from jasper, onyx, granite and marble. And just the ability of something like this, something so robust, to be able to absorb a Gothic cathedral in the centre of it, that tells, you know, its age. And you can see here the beginnings of the mosque, how it extended to here, how it eventually came to be this size, and then ultimately it started to eat into itself. And that kind of dialogue with kind of type and with construction really fascinates us. Much like the plan and its strengths in its geometry, there's also a very, very interesting relationship that it has with its edges, and makes for very interesting and compelling and unexpected kind of public spaces where corners might appear from the fabric, or where you get a tightening of a street at a particular junction. And this is the inside space looking down this hypostyle hall of varying columns of materiality, as I said, jasper, onyx, marble and granite. But what's very beautiful about this is the ability of a small column to be extended in its kind of profile by the first horseshoe arch with this red and white voussoir brickwork, and up to the second more substantial horseshoe that allows for this light to come in through the lanterns and makes for this very, very interesting kind of almost celestial kind of space up above. And it's something that we have become quite interested in, again, this notion of a hypostyle hall and making a room that has the potential to make many, many spaces within it. This is a much, I hope I'm not being too grand in kind of placing the Mezquita beside Granby Park, but there's certainly a kind of a relationship in our mind between the bay and the grain of these polytunnels and this roof that enables light to come in and water to be collected, and for varying pockets of inhabitation underneath it. This was one of those quick projects that we worked on. We collaborated with Sean Harrington Architects and Upstart, Sam Bishop being the driver of that, a terrific chap, and we continue to hopefully collaborate with Sam on future projects. But it was driven by a need to get over regulation. And again, this project would not get planning permission, and we decided to work with the promoters in thinking about this as an event space. And so long as it has 2 events per day, it can overcome the need to become a building. So it's an event space. So if you have an event in a building, you can build a building and you can get away without permission. Just so you know. But we kind of enjoy that kind of slightly subversive, corrupt kind of relationship with the city. And while Dublin City Council were terrific throughout this whole way, we have tried to engage in public realm kind of works with Dublin City Council, but it's so difficult to get anything or anywhere near that kind of scale of work. So we have to continue to kind of find opportunities. This is just a blown up axonometric of the strip footings that we put in concrete. We spanned those strip footings with kind of joists. Onto those joists we placed kind of a tatami mat of OSB boards, and over those OSB boards then we put the polytunnel hoops and the polycarbonate, the sheeting, the translucent sheeting, and underneath that it operates as a filterable kind of education hub where people have to pass through this building. These are some of the photographs. It's an enjoyable memory, and I suppose in a way it survives as a provocation to how we use our public space and why we don't engage a little bit more in that debate. Related to that density and that interest in plan is our project for Tullamore Community Arts Centre. And I will speak in a moment just about the news that we got there 2 days ago. But this is the Grand Canal as it connects the Shannon to the west with Dublin City. And our interest in kind of acknowledging this very, very strong enigmatic line that goes through the Irish landscape that is a man-made canal, and our project hitches itself against that geometry as opposed to any of the other geometries. And much like the Cordoba Mosque, again, there's an interest in the residual or the interstitial space that's left over from placing something as strong as a 48 by 48 metre footprint onto a pocket park and make for an interesting park that faces west. And again, we begin to see an interest in wood. We're still developing that technology in the office and trying to kind of like do it in an economical way. This project is about, it started off as being a 100% timber. That's an objective of ours, if anything, in our projects going forward. But it eventually became 3 concrete volumes that rise from the ground, and everything else is suspended off that as a kind of a filigree of very thin, deep and long beams that's skirted by this terracotta skirt around the edge, and these clear story elements pop up and animate the roofscape. So the plan, much like the school that we have the south here. This is a set of steps and a ramp that allows for the first public space that you meet, entering into a gathering kind of entrance foyer space that could be performative. Driving this was an interest in this art centre being participative as opposed to you going there just to take part in an exhibition. So the people of Tullamore would benefit in this from being able to take part and to actively work with art while they were going to this art centre. From the east, then from the Tullamore Jew side, we have another entrance, a cafe to the north and the west to benefit from views of the park and the canal, and then an opening out on to the west of the theatre. So you have this large double door that opens out and allows for this to operate on events like the Fleadh Cheoil. Very little circulation in the plan, bar the green corridor or the green room corridor for actors and their changing rooms. We were trying to actively think about how you might work the circulation into this quite dense 48 metre squared footprint. And just bringing you through diagrammatically the construction. These are the concrete volumes with the primary timber beams that are very, very substantial glulam beams, and then the secondary beams that are added into that to make for this roofscape, and then these skirts of terracotta of varying size and dimension, the taller depth for the theatre volume as it rises, and then the denser increment for the bottom skirt. And then this idea of a roof garden that would have this pattern of sedum planting and heathers and grasses that would grow to kind of make for this kind of collage of kind of garden. So some of the internal spaces again here where we were trying to, I suppose, pass the Coke can test. A lot of these art centres tend to become quite precious, and we were interested in making a factory-like space that would survive robust kind of interference with vending machines and kind of activity. So we were very interested in this notion of it being like a hangar. and a pleasure to be got from thinking about how you make one beam connect with another. A very, very simple problem. And this was working with our engineer, our timber engineer, Tom Gray, in tests in Paris, who we were lucky to work with on this, and developing ideas about how to conceal and to express or to expose fixings. And just a pleasure in that little exploration, if you like, that drives the whole project. And here, where we're getting rid of as much steel as we can and making a kind of a shoe bracket that allows for this beam to rest on the pocket that's made from battens that are surface mounted. And ultimately how it developed into very, very thin Curto beams, a laminating of 2 Curto beams that would run into the primary beam, which would be again a tall, thin glue laminated beam, and then you'd have cross bracing in order to support the lateral movement of these beams so that they wouldn't move ad infinitum with the pressures being placed on them. And simply on the top then we had a profiled aluminium unpainted deck with insulation and the sedum matting. There on Tuesday we got a call from the client who, unfortunately, after a year and a half of soul searching and cost exercises, decided to buy a former department store in Tullamore, and this project is deemed to the history books, unfortunately. So, you know, well, it was a difficult telephone call, but we wish them well, and we certainly learnt a lot from that. And it survives on in other earlier projects. This is a project that we dearly love in our office. This is the beach house in Termonfeckin in County Louth, looking west towards the potato fields. And again, an interest in taking in a clear story light, making datum in the houses, and an interest in materiality. Here, a reflective floor that has these kind of ribbons of terrazzo that effectively echo the ebb and the flow of tide. And on to other projects that we're continuing to develop with the OPW. This is a very small but very, very enjoyable project which we're hoping to start very soon. Based on the Fibonacci series, it's a small timber portico stroke lobby to the Limerick courthouse. It's probably one of the busiest courthouses and most filmed courthouses in the Irish state, and we're really looking forward to becoming part of the stage backdrop for that. But in this, again, it was an interest in how you might turn a door that has a need for a fire escape sign on the top into a window where it has a seat on the bottom, and how this doubling up of timbers and its connection back to a fan light over the principal door, and how to make a kind of a pleasurable, almost kind of reminiscent of the train carriage again, this interest in kind of detail and handle and kind of opportunistic geometry. And I'm almost there. This is the Handball Alley series that we did with Paul McCarthy and Aoife Murphy, husband and wife. And Paul and myself and Aoife have had a long interest, more so Paul and Aoife, in Handball Alleys, and I chose to support them there last year with an exhibition called Outcasts. And like the interest in ash and hurley and making and train carriage and the Dublin artisan house type, this here is another kind of more kind of outcast, if you like. It's effectively cast from concrete, it's resilient, it's there, it's quasi-sculptural, it's also extremely utilitarian and made by the local communities, generally at the edges of townlands. So if you ever look to the map of a townland in Ireland, you will more often than not see a handball alley at the fringe where 2 townlands could come and meet on neutral ground. And I find these typologies fascinating from the point of view of the materiality also, where you get an extremely smooth concrete interior and a much more robust, often buttressed form in the landscape. And as you can see here, it takes on the scale of a bus, a road, a hill, and becomes extremely charged. And in other more informal settings, this is in Wexford, along a street in a small village, where this almost becomes familiar with the boundary of this bungalow beside it, but also the garages and how it's able to make this kind of like kind of almost a presence within the town as a kind of a room waiting with expectancy. Apologies, these are large files. So from this study, what we chose to do was to make the scene in each of the photographs. We didn't visit all of them, we visited a number of them, and we chose to make a small architectural stage, if you like, in front of each of these photographs in order to enjoy and find pleasure in the individuality of these repeating types. None of them are the same. There's over 700 of them in Ireland, a lot of them endangered, but they all make for very unique kind of contexts. And this one particularly fascinates me, which is in Athenry up against the Abbey, where they've chosen to build a handball alley up against the gable wall, very brutally, but very honestly and very interestingly. Why do we not have conservation rules that allow for a continuity of structures like this? I think it's fantastic, absolutely brilliant. And this bridge structure on the other side of the road that is tiered in very slow, comfortable steps to allow for the viewing of this game as it's played. So you get this wonderful kind of elastic, kind of concrete relationship in the town that has this very active kind of dialogue with the kind of the grain and the constructions. And I suppose we got to build our own handball alley in Kistefos 2 years ago with John Gerrard again. John invited us to work with him in this kind of pavilion to house one of his own real-time art projections. And the site of this is along the River Rand, an hour's north of Oslo. And we were given a site that had a context immediate, which was a jetty in concrete that would pile all the logs coming down from the mountain streams before it got to the hydroelectric plant, and a boathouse. So there's this little dialogue going on between this kind of gathering of characters. And the difficult thing here for us was scale. We always were challenged to know how big to build this thing. And what's so enjoyable about this site was just its kind of scale and majesty. These trees are over 30 to 40 meters in height, huge birch trees and Sitka spruce trees. And this river acts as an audible kind of like soundtrack to the pavilion inside. This is the back of the pavilion where we have a small gazebo onto the river. So when you're in the artwork, you can come through this cantilevered wall and out and around to experience the river. In a very, very simple way, it's like a small little temple. In a way, you've got two side walls, an open section to the approaching visitor with two hinged doors and one pivoting door, and then a cantilevered wall that rises up that doesn't touch the side walls or doesn't touch the roof, and allows for this projection to exactly house itself on that wall. And when you are tired or have enough of the artwork, you can come around and find this quite nice bench that looks out onto the river through this kind of frameless glass balustrade. And in a way, the other interest in this is it's almost working with the technology. You're trying to make real a small data farm. This is a moving image inside in the pavilion. You're constantly panning around this recreated simulacra of the paper mill that John so carefully made. And in front of that image that kind of radiates its brightness, you have these precast concrete planks on brass shelves. And onto those precast concrete planks, you get these small data boxes that store every 3 months the image and the paper that this image makes inside in these boxes. So it's got a lifespan of 30 years. And in a way, it's enjoyable to work with technology and kind of make real the kind of the reality of technology. It needs to be stored, it needs to be powered. This pavilion is powered by the river. There's a hydroelectric dam just down the road that generates all of the electricity for this paper mill. And there's this nice dialogue going on between the raw power of the river and the making of paper from the logs that are around it. And John and ourselves working on this kind of 4.8 meter high by 6 meter wide by 13 meter long in situ concrete pavilion. And I still look at this and I think, God, it's so Irish, it's so kind of handball alley. I'd love to get a handball and start pegging it around inside there, but I'd probably be scorned. And these are some of the views. Again, the active river and this interest in framing the artwork with almost a halo of kind of view and light coming through. And then you can see here, these are the precast concrete benches that were made with the aluminium discs flush plated onto the top, so that when the data box is ready to be housed on that, you can place them on this kind of patterned kind of landscape that runs in front of the image. And this is the bench. The concrete was quite interesting in a way. It has its own kind of map-like qualities, almost a cartography in itself, and that kind of interested us, and we pigmented the concrete black on the two party walls in order to give it this darkness to allow for the image to survive. So lastly, I won't be too much more. This is another grid. I started with a grid of Limerick from in and around 1798 when it had its origins. This is 1895 when the city is just coming. This image is not from 1895 obviously, but its grid originates from the Great Fire, and there is this kind of interesting connection between Ireland and Chicago. There was lots of the city made. A lot of the people that got in at that time into Chicago established themselves very, very quickly, and it's very much an Irish city, and that was quite present to us while we were there. I could jump on to the other two great towers, but these are the other two towering figures. This is the ever graceful Michael Pike of Grace Keeley and Michael Pike, GKMP, and the tremendous Ryan Kennihan, Ryan W. Kennihan, I'll add. Two amazing guys. We had great time working with them, and Grace as well. I can't forget Grace. This is looking from the Art Institute on our first visit to Chicago last April, where we were very kindly asked to work, curated by Ray Ryan and Nathalie Weadick and coordinated by Rachel Gallagher, to design a room and to design a pavilion that would somehow present Chicago, and within those rooms and pavilions represent Ireland to a Chicago. So there was this kind of dialogue between reading Chicago and presenting Ireland, and the kind of the fusion of the two. And we were quite conscious of the history of the Irish connection with Chicago. Obviously you have greats like Robin Walker, Cathal O'Neill, Peter Doyle, Andy Devan with Frank Lloyd Wright. This is the Lakeshore Drive from under construction in 1949, built in 1951, based on a 9 by 9 metre grid of steel. That is so present in the kind of the making and the capacity of this city to kind of grow and rise. And we were quite interested in that dialogue with, or a continuity with, structure and construction, and almost a kind of a culture of making. And one particular project which we particularly liked was the Reliance building by Burnham and Root from 1890 to 1891. Daniel Burnham died during the construction of the ground and first floor of this. They only got to build the first two floors, and it was developed along with Atwood, William Atwood, and it was continued to rise in 4 years. This was a steel structure that was clad in very fine terracotta, and again a very, very interesting kind of relationship to surfaces and bending from one perpendicular surface to another, and how you might be able to achieve the first skyscraper by making these huge plate glass windows. And this is it under construction. You can see the ground and first floor are one type of structure, and then rising up from Washington Street you have this steel structure. And again, finding drawings and finding composite drawings of the cladding and the relationship of the terracotta to the steel structure, and how you could make something light and efficient, looking at the plan detail of just how fine all of these surfaces are and how particular they are, almost again like a precision engineering. Further details looking at the amount of steel and rivets. Two buildings that we visited, this is the Monadnock, or the base of the Monadnock, myself and Ryan looking at this kind of 3 metre deep bottom wall where you get these fantastic kind of blocks of granite, local pink granite from Illinois, and this huge big brick construction rising up from that gets thinner and thinner and thinner as it goes up to the top. This really kind of charged us when we were there. And the space that we were working in was kind of like the usual kind of almost common ubiquitous space in America. It's the shopping mall. We were up on the 2nd floor of the shopping mall. There was a pedway that went through this tower block, and we were in this atrium space. And we were asked to work with the Design Museum, the Chicago Design Museum. And we made this room, which is, again, quite pure in plan, but we were quite interested in its almost narrative relationship with construction. This is all about thin construction here. Plasterboard, sheetrock, glass, tile, surface. Nothing is expressed like the way Mies would have expressed it. And we were quite interested in working with that thinness, that fineness of depth. And all the same, we were also interested in having a dialogue with the kind of like the origin or the essence of the steel frame. So here we have, this is the curtain and the pavilion that we made. So there's a space to the entrance and a space once you go through the pavilion to the other side, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. And this was an original drawing by Ryan and his office that expressed this steel frame almost like as a grid, a continuous grid that would kind of echo the Illinois landscape as it runs towards the Rockies, this permeating grid. And that was made possible by reflective ceilings of mirror. So we found quite quickly a subcontractor who could fabricate a very lightweight acrylic mirror and could achieve this almost scenography for receiving our work on the walls and on the furniture that we would make underneath. And some of the working drawings that we produced again describe the lightness and the thinness of the construction. While we were interested in making something robust and heavy in its presence, we were also quite interested in its lightness. So you get a lot of suspension from the existing ceiling. This is the lamp, which I will talk about in a moment, and then a lightweight brass and MDF table that we made for our work on the floor. We made this trilateral, I won't call it a shamrock table, it is a trilateral table, that's what we like to call it. It's much more fine, we think. Again, it's a square, it's a 7 by 7 metre, 7.6 by 7.6, excuse me, and it relates to the 9 by 9 metre grid, again, of this shopping centre. These are steel I-beams that are encased in plasterboard and concrete for fire protection purposes. And here we make this fine construction in Chicago bars, as they're called, or these kind of Z-profiled aluminium stud partition sections. So this is of the presence. We chose not to paint the Chicago bars that are vertically kind of aligned on the outside, but paint the plasterboard black on the back to give it depth. And some of the kind of the grander pieces of furniture, this was something that we designed in collaboration with Charles O'Toole of One-Off Design, an incredible friend and character, incredible master of making. I would highly recommend him to all architects in the room. Very, very good to work with. And within the space of a month, he had made and fabricated this beautiful lamp for us, which was a brushed brass lamp with black cord wiring with Bakelite bulbs and beautiful kind of incandescent light fittings on the end. And into this room, we made this table, which ultimately started as a kind of a brass table, but eventually became this kind of finer table by just putting brass down on the sides of the MDF legs. So while it wasn't something that we could afford to build in brass, we tried to keep brass plate alive. And onto the sides of these we chose 3 areas, one for GKMP, one area for Ryan Kennihan, and another area for A2, and we would all share 3 pieces of this table that was plated in brass that would reflect and exponentially repeat our work in this kind of Chicago scenography. Our curtain is a little bit short. It's kind of like a young boy's school trousers, but that was just something that we had to get over and enjoy in the end, ultimately. And these are some of the projects. Michael and Grace's very fine models to the front, Ryan's beautiful models here, and some of our Tullamore Community Arts Centre models at the back. Stony batter features, ultimately, in a model. The beams ultimately were MDF painted black, again playing on the simulacra. And some of the photographs. This is a very nice photograph of Jack Hogan, thank you. The great Jack Hogan took some beautiful photographs on the opening night. And the Gold Pavilion, this is the pavilion that we're going to hopefully build. We have a global energy company and potentially an Irish company hoping to support us on this. Consciously in the back of our mind we had the casino at Marino, one of Ireland's finest neoclassical buildings by William Chambers. And up above is our pavilion. Likewise, it has 4 sides. There's no front or back. It has a volume up above that contains this world of mirror. This is the site here on Jackson and LaSalle in front of the Chicago Board of Trade. And in that kind of context, we have these brass bay windows with these beautiful ionic columns rising up from the Intercontinental Bank opposite it. And this is the pavilion on site. Again, it's brass to echo the kind of the continuing interest in material culture and construction, and some of the early models that we made, looking carefully at the structure and the capacity of structure to become the decoration. This being a truss that would have panels of brass plate on top, and this room would be occupied by entrepreneurs, two people at 3-month stints in the city in order to activate public space, working with the mayor's office in Chicago. So this is our plan to build this in the next 6 months, and it's rooflit and powered by solar panels on the upper part. So inside you get this kind of periscopic space. This is some of the construction drawings again. These are developed models. We had to suspend the pavilion up off the ground in order to deal with stormwater and snow build-up. Interesting demands. And inside then you get this tented roof of metal mirror panels that allow for the space to be projected out, as well as for the high skyscrapers around this pavilion to be brought in. And some of the renderings that we did for that in its place. I want to end with one slide. These are my office colleagues, along with Cuivon, Joan McElligott, David McInerney, Roy Cesarnardo, and Luis Pedro. And we have another one since, Matthew Mullen, another born A2er. But without all of this work, it wouldn't be possible. And I want to thank them sincerely for their ongoing work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Are there any questions from the floor?
I love a good question.
I might start. You talked at the beginning maybe about your admiration for engineer colleagues, and you progressed on to maybe looking at how finely detailed the inside of that train carriage was. I suppose in all of these projects, in some of them, so maybe to use your own words, you know, there's dirt dogs and strangers, and there's subversive, corrupt relationships, and there's quite simplistic finishes, and there's quite rough finishes. And then other projects, particularly the last 2 installations, there's quite finely detailed things In terms of developing that sensibility and understanding how light something can be, or when it needs to be rough, is that something that you continue to develop as you go on through experience?
Yeah,
How do you work on that as an architect?
I think we do. It's a reaction to the local space primarily. Firstly, each context is different. But just maybe going back to the point, it was something that Meredith and myself were discussing only 2 days ago, which was this kind of need to take hold again of space that has been deemed to the engineer. Like architects can think with a structural capacity as well. And while I don't say this work is a result of kind of deep engineering thought, I would like to think going on that there is that capacity to be able to break through boundaries of what an architect should be and to take on larger things like policy, regulations, procurement, and be actively engaged in that. I mean, I think a lot of our work comes from being involved or trying to get an involvement. So in a similar way, I suppose the making of these projects is about being involved and making something that is appropriate to its use and its setting, simply put.